Two young siblings scatter breadcrumbs, wandering deep into the forest. They attempt to escape the famine encroaching from behind, yet a different kind of predator lies in wait ahead. The tale of Hansel and Gretel, as recorded by the brothers Grimm, has often been framed as a metaphor for temptation and triumph. Children, abandoned by their parents in the woods, stumble upon a house of sweets and a witch who hungers for their flesh. However, folklorists have long pointed to a stark truth buried at the heart of this narrative. It is not the supernatural magic that defines the story, but the absolute physical reality of starvation. In medieval Europe, the forest was a boundary. It was the threshold between the ordered world of the fields and the chaotic, lawless realm ruled by death and hunger. People cast their unbearable realities beyond that frontier. That is the true, grim nature of the act described as abandoning children in the woods. What lurks within this fairy tale is not the lore of witches or the allure of candy. It is the chilling reality of the Great Famine that engulfed northwestern Europe from 1315 to 1317. Years of relentless rain and cold summers, crops rotted, livestock perished. Historical records suggest that 10% of the population starved to death. Confronted with such extremity, what choices was the community forced to make? History often uses the camouflage of fairy tales to shroud its cruelest decisions. These children were not simply finding their way with breadcrumbs. They were severed from the community, cast off by their parents, those once reliable barriers against death, in a desperate effort to preserve the remaining meager rations. It was the most primitive and perhaps the most rational process of survival imaginable. Beyond the original text compiled by the brothers Grimm lies a dark record of history. By stripping away the sweet, whimsical veneer of the fairy tale, we are left to analyze the raw, naked hunger of the Middle Ages and the moment when humanity was forced to cross the ultimate taboo.
In 1315, northwestern Europe, the centuries-long warm period came to a sudden end, and the continent was besieged by relentless torrential rains. The agriculture of the era relied on limited arable land and a fragile harvest cycle. This Great Famine was not triggered merely by poor harvests caused by natural disaster. Rather, it was the collapse of a delicate equilibrium, the stability of the climate, that caused the very structure of feudal society to rot from within. Farmers of the time surrendered the vast majority of their yields to their lords and to the church as tithes. Reserves were kept to a minimum, and a single failed harvest immediately pushed them beyond the limits of survival. The rain that began in the spring of 1315 prevented sowing, and by summer it had obliterated the harvest. The loss of the crop meant the loss of seeds for the following year. Once the cycle of reproduction was severed, the community began a slow yet inevitable dissolution. What we are witnessing here is not merely hunger. It is the disintegration of hierarchical survival. Food prices soared in the cities, while abandoned farmlands spread across the countryside. As fodder for livestock vanished, cattle and sheep were slaughtered or succumbed to disease. With the loss of essential nutrients like salted meat and dairy, the weakened population was then struck by a wave of pestilence. This lethal chain crop failure, hyperinflation, malnutrition, disease, and depopulation exposed the fundamental limits of the social system. What is critical is how legal order transformed under these pressures. Lords and authorities attempted to restrict distribution to secure their own tax revenues. But in a situation where food supplies were entirely cut off, the law lost all power. Markets vanished. Even simple barter became impossible. In this state of extremity, a cruel selection began within the community, deciding who should live and who should die. In this process, the most vulnerable were children, those who could not yet be calculated as labour. The decision to prioritise the survival of adults was shared as a consensus, whether conscious or unconscious, across the community. This is the historical background that would later be transformed in folklore into the symbolic act of being abandoned in the woods. Contemporary documents record the numbers of those starving at city gates, and accounts of people consuming tree roots, grass, and even unthinkable filthy matter, just to stave off hunger. These were not acts of barbarism. They were nothing more than the pure biological struggle for survival in an extreme state. To those who witnessed this catastrophe, the ordinary order had already crumbled. For them, discarding the next generation may well have been an unavoidable calculation for the preservation of the species.
When famine becomes chronic and communal food reserves run dry, humanity redefines its priorities for survival. In the rural society of the 14th century, this logic was profoundly cold. Children, who were not yet mature enough to be laborers, yet continued to consume the calories needed to sustain adults, were viewed, in the ledger of the household, as fixed costs to be cut first. The passage in the fairy tale about parents abandoning their children may well have been a process that, in that era, followed a certain legal and moral procedure. Parish records from the Middle Ages indicate a sharp increase in infants left at church doors, and children seeking refuge in forests or along roadsides. This should not be interpreted as a chain of individual madness or abuse, but rather as a survival strategy that the community silently condoned to endure the famine. We cannot dismiss this act as mere heartless criminality. For the peasants of the time, releasing a child into the forest may have been a final act of mercy, a gamble on a slim chance of survival, preferable to witnessing their slow starvation within the home. They did not abandon their children's lives, they sought to separate them from the overcrowded survival environment of the community, pushing them out toward any place where sustenance might be found. What is important here is how the act of infant abandonment was transformed within folklore. In many of the oral traditions closer to the originals recorded by the Brothers Grimm, it is the biological mother who decides to cast the children away. However, during the 19th century compilation process, this role was largely replaced by a stepmother. This suggests that society at the time found the reality of parents abandoning their own children too heavy, too unacceptable to bear. By restructuring the narrative, they projected the guilt of their own past onto an other. The image of Hansel and Gretel entering the forest at the beginning of the tale is not merely the start of an adventure. It symbolizes the process by which those cast out of the system are exiled into the void beyond the boundary. Their act of scattering breadcrumbs is the only physical marker to return to the community they called home, and their final attempt to cling to a social identity. But the bread is pecked away by birds, and they lose their path. At this moment, they are no longer defined as children of the family, but are redefined as individuals wandering the woods. And what they encounter beyond that is the metaphor for a power figure who monopolizes food, the witch. In the Middle Ages, those who managed to survive the famine, or those who appeared unnaturally plump amidst the starvation, were viewed by those around them as anomalies or demonized as monsters who steal food. What they saw in the forest was not a house of magic. It was the ultimate boundary for survival, crafted by the desperate gaze of a starving populace. Parental abandonment and the casting out into the non-ordinary realm of the forest. This story is presented to us as a kind of historical archive, continuing to record the blood-stained logic of survival that humanity has shared in order to endure the harshest of environments.
The grim memories born of medieval famine. How did they transform over the centuries into the form of the fairy tale we know today? In the 19th century, the collection of these stories by the Brothers Grimm brought a definitive shift. It was a transformation of the naked logic of survival into the moral framework of a social lesson. When collecting folk tales from across the land, the Brothers Grimm followed a common editorial principle. That was to suppress violent depictions and introduce a binary of good and evil that children could easily comprehend. By introducing the stepmother as a villain, they softened the cruel reality of parents abandoning their own children. Through this edit, the abandonment of children, originally a harsh choice for survival, was reinterpreted as an abnormal situation driven by the individual malice of a stepmother. This modification was also a form of societal resistance to facing its own past. For those who knew the famines of the 14th century, abandoning a child in the forest was a logical decision for survival, in which good and evil had no place. However, in the bourgeois society of the 19th century, it had become a crime, an act to be shunned. The fairy tale became a mechanism that translated the record of survival into a narrative that a civilized society could accept. The conclusion, the defeat of the witch, is also an imposition of a new lesson. In the Middle Ages, people were forced to consume foreign objects just to stave off hunger. In the modern era, this was rewritten into a heroic tale, more aligned with social order, the elimination of the monstrous. What played out in the depths of the forest was no longer a struggle for survival. It was transformed into a ritual where justice strikes down evil, according to modern values. We should not criticize this transformation. Instead, recognizing how historical trauma was replaced and inherited as lessons within these stories, that is the true perspective of history. The breadcrumbs scattered in the forest were, in the end, the only markers to return to the past that is history. But the place we have arrived at is not the house of a sorcerer. It is the memory of those who once gasped in the throes of hunger. The ending of this tale, perfected by the Brothers Grimm, treated the horrific events of the past as a resolved incident. It was, in effect, an attempt by modern civil society to forget the rupture of the past that lies beneath its own feet. The narrative connects to a reality that exists outside the story itself. The forest where Hansel and Gretel wandered is not a specific place on a medieval map. It is the very void of extremity that humans face when the protection of civilization is stripped away. Living in the modern world, we may believe that issues like famine and child abandonment are relics of the past. But if we shift our perspective, the forest continues to exist everywhere in modern society. Inequality, division, and the lonely individuals who fall through the cracks of the social safety net. Just as parents once released their children into the forest, are we not driving those deemed socially inadequate into invisible forests based on metrics of efficiency and data? The true reason Hansel and Gretel has been read for centuries is not merely for its entertainment value. It is because this story holds, encoded like a cipher, the fear of survival and the logic of exclusion that humanity has inevitably carried through history. We feel fear when reading this fairy tale, not because we fear the witch lurking within. It is because we see, in the mirror of the story, our own cold choices in times of extremity. It has been about 200 years since the Brothers Grimm compiled this tale. We have been freed from the physical death of famine that plagued those days. But the essence of what the story conveys has not changed. It remains the eternal question: what must we discard, and what shall we use as a marker in order to survive? The figure of Hansel and Gretel, scattering breadcrumbs and searching for the path home, overlaps with our own, wandering through the darkness of history, barely holding on to our humanity. We must never forget the lonely souls our ancestors once released into the forest. The fairy tale warns us: Turning our eyes away from the darkness of history is nothing less than creating the next forest with our own hands. At the end of the tale, they return home safely and regain their prosperity with treasures in hand. Yet, a cruel silence flows there. Is the treasure they brought back something that heals the tragedies of the past? Or is it a symbol of eternal atonement, exchanged for the many lives that were lost? Do not close the story at the edge of the forest. Instead, we must discern where that forest connects to us, here in the present. Perhaps that is the role of our generation, to breathe new life into this classic fairy tale, not just as a story, but as a record of history.